Well, thank you so much for being here this morning. My name is Paul. I get to be the campus pastor here at the Dalton Campus, so welcome. Glad to have you here this morning. Well, we are into 2024, first Sunday of the new year, 6 days in, and I'm not sure about you, but I always think about some things about this time of year. I'm kind of one of those goal setters, and I think about what happened last year, what's going to happen this year, and you know what? I have no idea what 2024 is going to bring. I cannot predict it. I can't predict if I will succeed or fail at any of my goals, just like I can't predict for you whether your business will succeed or fail, or whether you're going to crash your car and it's going to be totaled and you'll have to get another one. I don't know if you're going to get sick or if a loved one's going to get sick. I have no idea on how any of that's going to pan out over this next year. But here's something I do know. I do know that every single person here will experience conflict at some point in 2024. And so just for us to understand what conflict is to be incompatible or at a variance or clash with somebody. And when we start to think about conflict and about clashing with somebody, we kind of butt heads a little bit. There's some frictions. It could be because of something someone said or something someone did, but at any rate, we have this tension because of a person's actions towards us. Like I said, it could be over something we believe or something we hold. So why not just have some fun with this morning? I'm going to say a statement, and I want you, if you agree with the statement, to raise your hand. Okay? I'm going to say a statement. If you agree with it, raise your hand. Coke is better than Pepsi. How many agree? All right. I got some Coke lovers, and like Pat's over here is like, no. Pepsi all the way. In case you don't know, Pat used to work for Pepsi. Okay, how about this one? The nacho cheese Doritos, that is the red bag, is better than the Cool Ranch, which is the blue bag. A lot more people on the favor of nacho cheese. How about this one? Chevy is better than Dodge. I got some stink eyes from people. They're like, oh, I stepped on that one. Like, don't you be talking about my car. I could do this all day long. I could run these kind of ideas all morning long, and we'd all have our opinions about which drink is better or which chip is better or which vehicle is better. And you know what? We don't really make a big deal about it. We sure may tease each other or laugh at each other or whatever, but it's really not that big of deal for us. However, there's other things in our lives that are a little bit harder for us to process. Some of the thoughts and opinions that we do have, and when someone has a differing approach to life and they come at us with that, all of a sudden it's like, hey, wait, what? You know you didn't. You did not say that. You do not believe that. You're not going to get me to believe what you believe. You're not going to get me to act that way. That's not going to happen. Sometimes we have these conflicts, and they're over really, really silly things. It said, like what? Like the chips? Come on, Paul. Who's really had conflict over chips? You know what? I'd agree. I haven't heard a real drag-out fight over that. But how many times have we fought over what restaurant we dine at? It's like, oh, you do care which restaurant we go to, and it's not the one that I picked, and we have conflict right there in the car. See, conflict is available at every turn of our lives. It could be at work when our boss has to make a decision. So she makes the decision, and it affects us in our particular area of the company. We're like, man, I didn't appreciate the decision that she made. Or it could be at school. When a teacher or professor, they give you an assignment like write a paper, and they give the rubric, and you're looking over the rubric, and you're saying, yep, I've got everything on my checklist. I've got everything written out that she wanted, that he wanted, and so I submit what I believe is an A-quality paper because I submitted everything that they asked for, and they give a C. And then you notice the person sitting next to you didn't even make page requirement, and they got a B. And like, how is that even possible? That's not fair. What were you thinking, teacher, professor? See, we have conflict at every single part of our lives. In fact, I would say that conflict is unavoidable. It's just unavoidable. You can't protect against conflict. It's going to happen. It could be with a boss or a teacher. It could be with a coworker, a friend, a spouse. We could have conflict within the home with parent to child or child to parent or siblings. Siblings can fight it out. Police officers, crossing guards, even people at church we can have conflict with. And I will say, I've got the t-shirt for all of those. I've had conflict with every single person that I've just listed off. See, conflict is unavoidable. And yet, what I know is that peaceful conflict is doable. We may think conflict is unavoidable, but peaceful conflict is doable. And we can't stop conflict from happening. We can create a process, though, for navigating conflict in a peaceful and God-honoring way. In fact, God actually gave us a system for doing this. He wants us to have a process so that we can navigate conflict. And specifically, he's concerned with conflict that happens with the group we call the church, where we have a group of people like we have this morning listening to this message, and we're saying, hey, here's our people. This is the way we do life. And yet, even though we're all here this morning, we can kind of butt heads with one another from time to time. So he says, I want you to have a strategy to improve your life and improve the health and strength of our church. So we're going to unpack Matthew 18 this morning. If you'd like to follow along, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 18. What Jesus had just talked about in the verses prior to the ones we're going to be looking at, we're going to start in verse 15. But what he had said, he goes, suppose there was like 100 people gathered around, and 99 of them were doing life right, and they loved God, and they were honoring him with all the choices, and then one kind of makes a choice and walks away. You know what Jesus says he would do? He said he would leave the 99 that are doing life right and go chase after the one that kind of got away. He says, I love people, all of the people, even those that don't always do the right kinds of things, and I'm going to chase them down, and I'm going to bring them back. He goes, this isn't just my ministry. In fact, this is what he's calling all of us to do. So in Matthew chapter 18, he continues his teaching. He says in verse 15, he goes, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen to even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if 2 or 3 of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am among them. This morning, we're going to uncover a 3-step process to navigating conflict. So Jesus begins his teaching on conflict this way. He goes, if your brother sins against you. Now, when we read the word if, we may think there's a possibility in this. So we say it might happen, it might not happen, it's possible. But when Jesus says this, he goes, I know what's going to happen. It's not like it's unidentified, it might happen or not. He's like, it's going to happen. And then he says, if your brother, that's just a different way of saying that anybody who follows after Jesus, anybody who's a part of the church, who says, I want to follow Jesus with the best of my intentions and my abilities, that's who he's referring to. So we could actually write this and say, when your brother or when a fellow believer sins against you. That's how this could go. And Jesus says, I want you to do something very specific. He goes, as the verse continues, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Isn't that odd? How often do we do this? As we uncover the teachings of Christ, the first step that we need to take to peacefully navigate conflict is we need to talk privately. We need to talk privately. Jesus' plan for peaceful conflict is to talk to the person with whom we have an issue. Do you know, so many times when we have conflict, that's the last thing we do? We all of a sudden had a bad day, someone did something to us, and do you know what our first reaction is? Is we get in and we talk to anybody and everybody who will listen. It could be the delivery guy dropping a package off at the house and say, hey, buddy, you got a minute? You'll never guess about my day. We don't even know the guy's name, and we're just spewing off this stuff about how bad our day was. And we go around our friend circle and we say, let me tell you about so-and-so. It was so rough because they did this, and they did this, and they did this, and I don't like it, and I'm upset. And they just say, oh, that's a terrible day. But what Jesus says, he goes, I want you to go to that person with whom you have a conflict. So we go to them, but what are we supposed to do? The first thing that we have to do is we have to identify the issue. We have to identify the issue. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, that's the qualification for this. That's the criteria for navigating conflict. He mentions that the conflict at hand needs to be the level of sin. A lot of times we have people who have personality traits that are just straight up annoying. Have you ever met somebody who you just are annoyed with? You walk into their presence, you're like, I'm just annoyed right off the bat. I said hello and I'm annoyed. And it's just the way that they conduct themselves, right? I've been around those people. You've been around those people. He says, is that what we need to address in this moment? I goes, no. Love it over. Not everybody's going to do life the way you do it. But what did they do to you? Was it a sin? You have to clarify that. You have to identify the real issue. There's certain things that we just need to cover over with love. But then there's other things that we have to go and talk with them. So we could go and talk with them or we cover it over. That's the only two options that we have. We either are going to love them in spite of it, or we're going to go and address it to them. For some of this stuff, we have to go and talk to the other person. There's a story about two friends. These two friends loved to do life together. They did everything together. In fact, they were so close that they dressed alike, they talked alike, they had the same interests, they liked the same kinds of foods, they liked the same kinds of entertainment. They just did life together very, very well. Then all of a sudden, something happened. And one of the friends started to think, I feel very hurt by some things that my friend has been saying to me or lack thereof. I started this friendship, and as I went through this friendship, we did everything together. We'd text all the time. We'd call all the time. We'd just check in with each other. We'd do stuff together. And over the past several months, it just doesn't seem to be both-sided. And so we're kind of hurt because the one friend isn't doing anything. They're not reciprocating the friendship. And the other one's saying, I'm doing all the work. So the friend started to pull back, the one that felt like he was doing all the work. He pulled back and goes, fine, if you want space, I'll give you space. I'm not going to talk to you. I'm just going to stop talking altogether. Silence increased, and so did the conflict. And everything started to get bothered. Every single little offense started to rise and mount up. So what do we have to do? At one point, the friend says, you know what? I've got to have a conversation. I got to figure out what's going on within this. I've got to figure out what's my big deal. What is it that's bothering me so much? So one friend said, you know what, I'm going to try to do what Jesus says. I'm going to try to think through the issue. So I started asking questions like, did they dishonor God? Is that why I'm upset? Did they break a relational commitment? I want to have people who are kind and respectful and selfless. Did they break that kind of thing, the kind of things that God told us we should be doing? Maybe they witnessed an action that affected their usefulness before God. See, we have to stop and consider what the actual offense was. Some of it we should release under the banner of love, but other things we can't allow to keep on functioning the way it is, because in truth, if someone is walking in sin, it will actually remove the blessings of God in them. And we say, man, that relationship is too important for me to let them just walk away from this, and I need to address this issue. Our friendship is too important to allow it to separate and to divide. So we have to identify the issue before we have any type of conversation with the person. We identify what the root issue is, and we say, you know what, these are the one or two different things that I really need to address. It's not the 1,800 things that I've created. It's really, I feel hurt, and I feel like the friendship is one-sided. That's what, in our story here, that's what's happening. So we've identified the issue. So now what do we need to do? We need to schedule the conversation. We need to schedule the conversation. We need to reach out that person and say, hey, can we get together? I have some things that are on my mind that I'm not sure how to process. I would love to sit down and talk with you. And as we begin to schedule that meeting, some of the things that we have to do, Jesus says, I want you to go and talk to that person privately. And sometimes what happens is if we're not careful, we'll just bullhead rush right into this thing. And we're going to be spiked up on emotions. We're going to be spiked up on all of the hurt and frustrations that we have. And so if we're not careful, what we'll do is we'll just run in and say, you've offended me, and this is how you did it. No. And we run the list, and we'll say, have a good day. And we walk away. Guarantee you that's not how you do conflict resolution. What you have to do is you actually have to schedule the conversation. You have to give yourself time to have that conversation. Do you know what that means? That means we don't schedule a conversation like this on our lunch break. We have 30 minutes for lunch, and it's like, I could get this done in 30 minutes. So we go to the person like, hey, let's grab lunch together. So we grab lunch together. We have the conversation, and we list out all of our hurt. After we grab our lunch, we list out our side. We have 5 minutes left on our break. They can't even have a conversation with you. They said, I don't even know what to do with this. And again, it separates. It doesn't help resolve the situation. So we look at our schedule and we say, you know what? Thursdays are my days off. I'm free all day Thursday. I have nothing going on Thursday. Are you available on Thursday? You pick the time. We think through their feelings. We say, where would they feel most comfortable at? How could we have this? Maybe it's at a restaurant or a coffee shop. Maybe it's at a neutral spot. Maybe it's at our house. I don't know. We find a spot where both parties are excited to be at and comfortable at. And then we make sure we have enough time to unpack the conversation. So we're not bookended with conversations and meetings and all of this where it's like, well, I've got to leave right now in the middle of this thing. We have to actually sort it fully out. So we schedule the conversation. And you want to give the time. Why? Because time is the currency of all relationships. Every single relationship demands time. So we want to invest as much time. So maybe you block off 3 or 4 hours for this conversation, depending on the offense. You sit down and you have that conversation. You start to talk with them, and it's resolved in 30 minutes. Wonderful. You just got 3.5 hours of freedom. You can do with it whatever you want. But if it required 4 hours, then you've got it stay back in your back pocket on your schedule. And you say, man, that's what's going to help. So we schedule this conversation. But then we have to prepare for it. We have to prepare for this. We can't just simply walk into this type of conversation and wing it. The relationship is too important. The conversation is too important. See, usually if we just rush into it, we'll say all the stuff that we've been feeling, all these frustrations and hurts, and we'll feel them. And then we'll say stuff, and in that emotional response, guess what happens? We often will say stuff we will later regret, or we won't say the thing that actually needs to be said. And so if we don't take a few minutes to prepare for it, we won't be able to do this, what Jesus is asking us to do, in a good and God-honoring way. So, for most of us, I think we want to please Jesus. That's why we're here this morning. We want to make sure we're following him. And so we see what he says in Matthew 18. It says, I have to have a conversation with some people. But I also want to make sure that I'm speaking the truth in love from Ephesians 4:15. I also want to practice the golden rule from Matthew 7:12, where it says, treat others the way I would like to be treated, which really just means we should respect other people. So through this, I've found a lot of different ways to have these conversations. And so this is just some things that I've used in my life, things that try to honor what we're looking at from Matthew 18. The first one is called the unpleasant sandwich. The unpleasant sandwich. And you say, what in the world is an unpleasant sandwich? Well, you begin this type of conversation. This is a preparation thing. And so you begin to think through the positives of a conversation with that person. It's so two friends are at odds with each other. It could be two friends, coworkers, people you go to church with. It could be a bunch of people. At any rate, you have friction in that relationship. And say, you know what? I'm going to back off, and I'm going to think through their positives. What are the good things that they have? What are the good traits that they have? Maybe it's a close friend. You say, you know what? I've always appreciated your friendship. I've always known that you're going to have my back no matter what. You challenge me in a good way that pushes me to be a better person. I really appreciate that. And then after that, you have to start with the positives, and then you move into the issue. And so as you're moving into the issue, you all of a sudden start to think through all of the scenarios and all of the things that are calling for this type of conversation. And as we're preparing, I would encourage you to jot this stuff down, to make a note, even if it's a bullet point. We say we're going to start with the positive, and here's the big issue. We're going to narrow it down to one or two. We're not going to create this huge thing with 500 little subpoints to it. We're just going to say, if we're going back to the story, I feel like the friendship's lopsided, and I feel like you don't really want to be my friend. And so we just get those two parts in our head, and we're going to come through this, and we're preparing for it. So we have the two major issues. Then we think through of all of the things that they could say in rebuttal. We think through how that conversation is going to play out. You could say, hey, they could be just in agreement. I voiced this to them. I had this issue. I feel like the conversation's one-sided, the relationship's one-sided, and they say, you know what? You're right. I haven't texted you. I haven't called you. I haven't done anything with you in the past 3, 4, 6 months. I'm sorry. Like, well, shoot, that only took a few minutes. But then they could also say, who are you to call me out like this? How often have you texted me? You think I don't text you? When was the last time you texted me? And they could be really angry. You say, okay, so if they respond that way, how am I going to respond? And my goal is to keep my emotions in check and stick to the facts. And so we work through that issue in our mind all by ourselves. We're saying, I'm going to have this conversation. I'm going to start with something positive. Here's how I think this conversation is going to play out. At the end of it, we end it as positively as we possibly can. That's what has to happen. So within that, we could say, if they did scenario one where they just agreed and apologized, we said, you know what, this is why I love you. This is why you're such a good friend to me, because I can come to you and just talk to you about stuff that's bothering me. And so I appreciate that. Or maybe it's more on the negative side and you're like, I don't even know how to stop this from going any further. It's not going anywhere well. We say, you know what, I really value this relationship. Maybe we need to take a minute, regain our composure, and come back. Maybe, are you available next Friday? Are you available over the weekend? Can we get together again? Because I really would like to resolve this. Could we keep it up? And that's a positive way of, even if there's tension, to say I'm still a pro of this relationship. See, as we're thinking through all of these things, we have to give ourselves enough prep time so that we can actually have a real conversation. However, sometimes conflict isn't what we think. Sometimes our perception is a little wrong. We see things and we interpret data and we didn't draw the right conclusion, and we're not positive if we're getting it right. We're pretty sure, but we're not positive. There's another method that I've used. It's called OIC. And it's kind of a play on words. It's like, oh, I see. We can understand it like that. But what it stands for is observation, interpretation, and clarification. And so what can happen is when we go back to our story of the two friends, it's like, it seems like this conversation or this relationship is kind of one-sided. I don't feel like I've seen you call me or text me. I haven't seen those. I haven't felt your presence very much. And I'm not really sure what to make of it. Observation, that's factual. You can pull out your phone and it's like, I haven't gotten a text from you in forever. I haven't gotten a phone call from you forever. We haven't gotten together forever. That's facts. Which makes me interpret that to say, maybe you don't really want to be my friend. Or maybe I did something that offended you and I'm not sure what it is. Then you ask for the clarification. Am I missing something? Am I drawing the wrong conclusion? Can you help me understand what's been going on over the past several weeks and months? And I will tell you, either one of these models have helped me as I've processed through these types of difficult conversation in an attempt to honor what Jesus said to talking to the person privately. At any rate, whatever model you choose to use, we have to take time to prepare for it. And perhaps if we take that first step, when we do that first step well, and they're coming at it from saying, I want to honor Jesus as well, and maybe we can just have that one conversation and be done with it. This is what Jesus says at the tail end of verse 15. He goes, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his faults between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. End of story. It's like, great. Friendship continues on. Our unity continues on. This is the win-win situation because the goal of navigating conflict is to reach a peaceful resolution. And we can do this. And I guarantee you, all of us in this room have had conflict in our lives where that has happened, where you've had a conversation with a close friend and you said, you know what, that hurt me, that offended me. They say, I'm sorry. You move on and you don't bring it up again. And we just move on. But sometimes that's not what happens. Jesus goes on to say in verse 16, but if he does not listen, you've tried the one conversation, you've had that repeatedly, he's not listening, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. Our second step in this process is we need to talk to a couple of godly advisors. We need to talk to a couple of godly advisors. Their job is to review the facts, to make sure that the offense is actually real, to make sure that it's substantiated, make sure that there's been something that was done, and that that first step had been accomplished, that they had actually gone to that person and tried to take that first step. This idea of taking 1 or 2 people with you actually comes from Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 19, it says this, a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong, in connection with any offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. Now in Deuteronomy, that was going towards the court of law. He was saying, if you're going to have an issue like a lawsuit, he goes, you're not just going to be able to say something on one person's testimony. You have to have that by 2 or 3 in order to establish facts. We get that. And what Jesus is saying, he goes, if that works in the court of law, how much more should that work in the church? How much more should that work with people who are trying to please Jesus? It says, grab a couple of people and run it by them. See, we should talk to wise people that can bring clarity to the situation. That's what we need to do. We talk to one or two people to have that situation brought to a resolution. See, every time we talk about it, it keeps the wound open. It doesn't offer the healing that it needs. But here, it's not so much just to reach a verdict as much as it is to see restoration. We want to see both parties growing in the relationship with God and with each other. If one did wrong, they have to own that. They have to apologize for it. The other one has to also accept their apology and move on. However, our minds are often faulty. Have you ever realized this? Have you ever realized that when you've gotten hurt, all of a sudden it's like, this is what they did. They always do this, or they never do this. By the way, those are words that we probably shouldn't use because it's not true. Most often than not, we say something like always or never. It's not true. It's like, you never do this. And it's like, never? I was like, I know I did it at least once. Like, there's always that. He said we shouldn't be using that kind of thing. So when we have these 2 or 3 people coming in, we can talk to them, and they'll start to poke into that story and to say, hey, what really went down? How do you want me to help you? Unfortunately, sometimes we don't really want closure. We don't really want this to move on towards unity. We want the hurt to continue. We just want to vent it out to as many people as can hear it. See, we should avoid talking to lots of people. Sometimes we just relive and retell the story so we can gather sympathy votes. And although the story is painful, there is something satisfying in talking about it. There's something satisfying as we can relive this story about how terrible this person is, and we push them down in everybody's eyes, and we're just pushing them down, and we get some type of satisfaction out of that. Sometimes when we have situations within the church, I've been in the church for a long time, and sometimes people say, hey, I got a prayer request. And I said, what's your prayer request? And they say, well, so-and-so did this, and they did that, and I don't really know what to do with this. And they share this whole story. And then you're like, so what do you want me to pray about? And their response is, the situation. Just pray for the situation. And I was like, no. That's not how this works. That's called gossip requests, right? When we just share a statement like that without really asking for the wisdom of God to impact us, and when we're not really looking for any type of resolution, we're just sharing it in a way that we think is more palatable. Sometimes we just have to talk to a couple of people. And why do I say that? Number one, Jesus says talk to them privately or then talk to 2 or 3 people. That should be reason enough. But if we could just pause right there. Let's just suppose, so far up in this sermon, we've been looking at the person who's offended us. What happens if we are the ones who have offended somebody else, whether intentionally or unintentionally? If we were the ones that did the offending, how would we like it if our story was shared all over creation with anybody who would listen? I guarantee you none of us would appreciate that, especially if it was an unintentional action. It was like, I didn't even know I said that. I didn't even know I did that. I didn't know how you understand. I'm sorry. But it's too late. The damage to their reputation's already been done because it's been blasted all over. And even after it becomes known, guess what? We don't often go back and fix it. We often don't go back to those people that we've blabbed all over and say, I was wrong. He didn't realize. She didn't realize. We don't clear up the mess. And so now his reputation, her reputation has been tarnished. At this point, we have to think through our purpose in all of this is reconciliation. And sometimes it's enough at this point where we had private conversations, and then we had a couple of people, 3, 4 people, and we had that conversation, and now they're still not moving forward in the right direction. Jesus says in certain cases, it keeps pushing up. He says in verse 17, he goes, if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. The final step that we should take is that we need to remove their influence. We need to remove their influence. The person who has created that relational conflict says, you know what, I've done nothing wrong. I'm not seeing it, even though that this person addressed it, even though these couple of people have addressed it, even though a group of people from the church have addressed it. I don't see what they're seeing. I'm not wrong. It's all on them. And he says, if you get to that point, you have to treat them like a Gentile. That is, someone who doesn't believe the things that we believe in. Now, that doesn't mean we should treat them like garbage. That doesn't mean we push them out. That actually means we love them. Remember? We're supposed to love people who are outside the family of God. We're supposed to treat them with respect. He says, I want you to do that. But inside of this, he says, I want you to do this in a very specific way. In verse 18, he goes, truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am among them. Sometimes we use these couple of verses to talk about prayer meeting. A prayer meeting is where people gather together to pray. And we say, well, as long as there's two or three of us gathered together, we've got the presence of God, and it's more powerful if two or three people are coming together. But here we have to understand what Jesus is saying. He's saying, I'm not calling for just a general prayer meeting of people. Just as a reminder, God's presence is everywhere. And it's just as powerful as when I'm by myself as when I'm with two or three other people. We have to understand that. He says, what is he talking about here? He says, when we have a relational conflict, and you're thinking about the steps that need to be taken, and you've got two or three people that are thinking, man, what should be done? He says, come to me, you two or three people. You've had the individual private conversation. You've had the small group conversation. You have had the church. And now you're considering how to treat them going forward, potentially removing their influence out of the church. That's a serious conversation. That will affect them in one of two ways. And if it's not done with the wisdom of God, it could end disastrously. He says that the whole point of this is to have reconciliation, to restore people. That's why we do this. So I want you to come, two or three or four people come together and pray and say, God, please give us wisdom. Please let us handle this with delicacy. Please let us understand what steps should be taken. And sometimes at this point, what can happen is that we get into our timeline of offenses. If someone offends me on Monday, I go to them on Tuesday and say, I'm ticked off. They didn't respond the way I want. So I go to two or three people and they didn't respond. And so it's like, come on, Paul, let's boot them. It happened in a week. It's like, no. We have to understand this is relational. This is complicated. It takes a minute. It takes some time to walk through that. So we may have individual conversations repeatedly. It may be once a week, it may be once a month, but we're going to have a lot of those. Then we're going to bring in two or three and say, man, I've been doing the steps. I've been talking with them, and I've been praying with them, and I've been praying for the situation. It doesn't seem to be working. Would you mind sitting in with me, two or three people? Let's have this out. And that may take another 3 or 4 months. And then it may be brought into a bigger section of the church, and they say, let's talk about this. And that may take 2 or 3 or 4 more months. This is a long process. It's not done quickly or lightheartedly. He says, I want you to be praying for the wisdom of God. The thing is, fortunately, we don't have to get to that point. We don't have to go DEFCON 10 on this right now. We just don't. And I think actually, if we could go into our conflicts, we can actually have peaceful conflicts. Conflicts are unavoidable, but peaceful conflicts are doable. But we have to stay fixed-gazed on our end goal. What is that? It's to see people walk and honor Christ. Now, I'll say, we don't always get it right. Even with our best of intentions, we don't get it right. In fact, I've never met anybody who says, I've done it right all the time. Never met any single person who claims that. But I will tell you, when we have been offended, we owe it to the person to at least have a conversation with them. To say, I was offended, here's why. We owe it to them. They may be unaware of their offense. They may not even know they hurt you. They may not understand how their words came across. They may be oblivious to it. But for the sake of your spiritual health, and the sake of my spiritual health, and the sake of this church, we owe it to each other to say, I value these relationships so much that I have to come together in unity. Do you know, right now there's so much disunity all over our world. And this is the spot where we as believers need to gather together and to say, we're not going to be like that. We're not going to be like divide and conquer, kind of like, you don't agree with me, so we're no longer friends. We can't do life. Say, no. The relationship's too important. I'm going to air it out. We're going to talk it out. We're going to take the steps to resolve the conflict. I think if we could just do step 1, That would solve probably 99% of all of our conflict. If we could simply bravely go to that and have a conversation with somebody and just say, hey, look, you hurt me, and this is how, I think we wouldn't even have to think about step 2 and 3. Most of our conflict would be resolved if we simply talked it out. We articulated what we were offended about, what went down. We say, you hurt my feelings because you did this. We apologize, we move it on, and we don't bring it up. There's 2 guys in our Bibles. Their names are Peter and Paul, 2 church leaders. And you would think that 2 church leaders certainly would have understood this principle, right? You would have thought 2 church leaders certainly wouldn't have made any type of mistakes when it comes to relationships. Well, here's what was going on. Peter, he was a church leader, and he liked to be liked. I understand that. He wanted people to like him. And he understood that the gospel of Jesus was available to anybody and everybody. And so what he would do is he would go up to people who were non-Jewish people. That was what the Bible would refer to as Gentiles. He would go and hang out with them. He would eat at their restaurants and drink with them, and they would have a fun time carrying on and said, the gospel's for you too. Let's have a great relationship with God as we have a great relationship with others. Problem for him, he was Jewish by birth. And so when the Jewish people would come into town, he would push the Gentile people away and hang out. And he goes, I can't believe them. Look at what they're doing. And he would hang out with them, and they would say, we like you. That's awesome. Good job, Peter. And then they would leave town, and he'd go back, hey, guys, it's good to see you. It's been a minute. Let's go grab some supper together. Let's hang out. Let's play some games. Well, Paul heard about this, another church leader. And he says, you're doing this in the public, Peter. So he calls them out. He goes, you're living a duplicity of life. You're saying you're acting one way with these group of people, and you're acting a different way with this group of people. Do you understand what you're doing to the church? You're creating confusion amongst the people. This isn't right. This isn't right. You shouldn't be doing this. And he said, if I was Peter, how would I respond to that? This was an open one. He said this was an open conversation. It would be like having someone up here yelling at me right in front of all of you. I wouldn't like that. I'd be hurt. I would probably retreat a little bit. But you know what Peter does? He takes it. When you get to the end of Peter's life, he's writing in 2 Peter, and in chapter 3:15, he says, remember our beloved brother Paul. It's amazing what happens when you have conflict and when you have resolution and when you actually weigh in to the things that are separating and dividing. He refers to the guy who called him out as his beloved friend, his close and dear friend. See, there's a way to have peaceful conflict. You know, on a personal note, I've had conflict, and probably the people that I've ticked off the most are the people that are closest to me. They see me every day, and they see all of my sin every single day. And yet I would not trade my relationships with any of them for the world. Why is that? Because we will work through it. We have conversations. We say, I apologize. This is what I did was wrong. We have open conversations. And then there's forgiveness that is offered. And then we don't bring it up. It's been washed out. And so we don't keep bringing it up. It says we've dealt with it. We talk to them, we apologize, we move on. We have to get to the point where we say, I love the person enough to risk an uncomfortable conversation so that we can restore the relationship with one another and ultimately restore a relationship with God. This past week, I was reading through a book and came across a brief paragraph from a German theologian. His name was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He says, sin demands to have a man by himself. It withdraws him from the community. The more isolated a person is, the more destructive will be the power of sin over him. And the more deeply he becomes involved with it, the more disastrous his isolation. Sin wants to remain unknown. It shuns the light. Since the confession of sin is made in the presence of a Christian brother, the last stronghold of self-justification is abandoned. The sinner surrenders. He gives up his evil. He gives his heart to God and finds forgiveness of all of his sins in the fellowship of Jesus and with his brother. I'm not sure what 2024 will bring, but I guarantee you it will bring conflict. But having peaceful conflict is a choice we can all make. We need to start with those talks privately and move them up the line as needed. You know, throughout this message, we've been referring to 2 friends. We've had 2 friends that were in conflict. And I just want to be transparent. That wasn't a made-up story. That's me. I had that conversation about a month ago. I had several months where I was dealing with one of my close friends where I thought I knew all of the facts. The description that I gave was my course of action. I pulled back. I withdrew. And it was starting to create more conflict and problems. So finally I just said, we need to have this out. We had the conversation. To my surprise, there was a backstory that I had no idea about. Heard the whole backstory, and everything shifted on a dime for me. Because all of a sudden, a whole bunch of things lined up in a way that I never could have thought of. I heard the story. My friend offered his apologies for the hurt that had happened to me, and I offered an apology back to him. And I said, you know what? We should always talk. We had gone months without talking, and finally we had this conversation. We brought each other back, and our relationship is probably stronger today than it was even prior to the offense. It wasn't fun. It wasn't the most wonderful conversation to have in a restaurant. But we asked for a back booth, and we went to the back, and we just had it out in a controlled manner. And we wanted to please God. Both of us wanted to please God. And so we came to this peaceful restitution. See, this choice that we can make is to have peaceful conflict. It is not to avoid those conversations. We want to think that if I engage in that conversation, that somehow that's going to affect us in a negative way. So we just pull it back, and we have artificial harmony, where we allow this to have like this pleasantries where we can shake hands and say, hey, how was your Christmas? And we have these kind of surface level conversations, but inside there's deep hurt that has never been addressed. And so it's like as long as we leave that deep hurt never addressing it, guess what? There's going to be some battle scars in us that will prevent us from having true, meaningful relationships with one another, and ultimately it will affect our relationship with God. So this week, some of you are in that moment right now. Some of you are in conflict right now. And you showed up to church and like, oh, crap, I wasn't expecting this to happen today. Why did he have to talk about this? That's what you're going through your head. It's like, why are you talking about it? Because I guarantee you, you're going to have conflict. We all do. But there's a way we can have that conflict in a way that promotes peace with God and peace with one another. We have to follow the steps that he gave us. Some of you are not in conflict land right now. Everything's great. I hope you're wrong, Paul. I'm seeing some head nods as I've been talking. Like, nope, it's coming. I know it's coming. So maybe if you're not in that conflict zone right now, you need to take this sermon and just post it somewhere else for a later date to remind yourselves there's a way to do this. The people that are in the conflict zone right now, I would encourage you, schedule the meeting. Get the conversation on the table. Maybe that's this week. Maybe you're not in the space to have that conversation today, but pick a date. Maybe it's into February now, and you say, I'm going to pick it on the calendar, I'm going to put it down, I'm going to have the conversation, because the things that get put on the calendar typically happen. So mark it down. Say, we're going to have a conversation, and then spend the next couple of weeks preparing for that conversation. And as you walk through that, at any point, if you need a point of reference, I'd be more than willing to sit down and talk with you to give a different perspective. I'd love to partner with you on that, but really I want us to see us growing together in a strong, unified kind of way. Father in heaven, I thank you that Jesus gave us this teaching on how to handle conflict. Lord, as we think about conflict that's going to happen this year, I ask that you would help us to do it in a way that would honor you. We don't always get it right, but our desire is to do the right kinds of actions in this world. I ask that you'd help us to walk through conflict in a way that would honor and glorify you. Lord, I pray for the situations that I don't even know about, conflicts that are happening currently. I pray that you'd give a great deal of wisdom to people that are having these types of conversations or that are going to have these conversations. I ask that you would give them the boldness, the strength to have the conversation, and that there would be a peaceful resolution on the other side of it. Lord, help us to honor you today. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.